Want the freshest cup of coffee in Gettysburg? Then visit Bantam Roasters, formerly 82 Cafe at 82 Steinware Avenue. They roast all of their coffee in-house, and they have a full coffee bar to keep you caffeinated during your trip. Visit them at www.raggededgerc.com for their menu and shipping options for all of their freshly roasted coffee. Use promo code Hancock for 10% off your order in the cafe.
The 1863 civilians of Gettysburg were reluctant witnesses to the Great Battle. Join Ken Rich, the man in the red shirt, for his historic town walking tours. You could book these tours by emailing ken@gettysburgtownhistory.com. That's ken@gettysburgtownhistory.com. And when you're in town, look for the guy in the red shirt.
Enjoy historical stories on the History Fix platform. Explore movies, short films, and documentaries. Addressing Gettysburg podcast fans receive an extra $5 off the first year's annual subscription. Sign up at historyfix.com and use promo code Gettysburg. Every subscription includes a 7-day risk-free trial. Escape into history with History Fix.
This episode of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you in part by me, audiobook narrator Mike Scott, narrator of Savis Beattie's Bloody Autumn, the Shenandoah Valley campaign of 1864, and Unlike Anything That Ever Floated, the Monitor and Virginia and the Battle of Hampton Roads. If you are an author or publisher interested in having your titles produced as audiobooks, or even just in learning more about the process, give me a shout. You can find my contact info on my website, mikescottvoice.com. That's mikescottvoice.com.
And Civil War Trails. It's the world's largest open-air museum, and they offer over 1,300 sites across 6 states. Drive the Gettysburg campaign turn by turn, paddle to Frederick Douglass's birthplace, or hike to remote earthworks and artillery positions. Visit civilwartrails.org to request a brochure and explore their interactive map. Follow Civil War Trails and create some history of your own. All free episodes of Addressing Gettysburg are brought to you by our sponsors and our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. To become a sponsor, send an email to matt@addressinggettysburg.com. And to be a patron, go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg today. And we thank you in advance.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Actually, it comforts me that you're it comforts me that you're here.
Why is that?
I don't know, because I don't like talking to adults generally. I'm a kid person.
And I'm immature.
And a teacher person.
Like
maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, it makes you feel like you're talking to a kid.
I can talk to teachers. I can talk to kids. It's, you know.
Well, so I'm like in between then.
Yeah.
I'm a man child.
Yeah.
Thanks, Barb.
No prob. Okay, 1:30 on the dot. Thank you all for coming today. It's a beautiful day outside. I don't know what you're doing here, but I'm happy to see you. My name is Barbara Sanders. I'm the education specialist here at Gettysburg National Military Park. I've been here since, January 1998, and in this capacity since February of 1999. It is the most fun job at the park. I stand by that. So I'm normally talking to children, which I'm way more comfortable with, but I'm very happy to have them. Just a couple of things about just some books that you might be interested in. I hope, if you haven't heard of them, I hope you'll be interested in them perhaps after hearing the lecture today. There are a lot of books. One of the most fun things about doing a lecture here is when you go back to work the next day and you can return all the books. So these are not all of the books, but I used The History of Company K by H.N. Minnig. I'm going to be talking about Minnig today. He's pretty much tied for my favorite soldier ever. We'll talk more about that later. The Colors of Courage by Margaret S. Crichton. Gettysburg Rebels, 5 Native Sons Who Came Home to Fight as Confederate Soldiers by Tom McMillan. And, of course, The Stand by A Strange and Blighted Land by Greg Cucko. So, and if you want any other book recommendations, I'm happy to do that. Also, our research library is once again reopened by appointment, usually on Wednesdays. So if you want to come in and go through any damage claim files of the local residents, that would help us out a lot. Feel free to make an appointment. So, how many of you, by a show of hands, were born at the Annie M. Warner, now Gettysburg Hospital? All right. Okay. How many of you were raised in Gettysburg? Okay. Or Adams County? Okay, it's all these same people right in here. Okay, these are my people. These are my people. Okay, how many of you have transplanted to Gettysburg or Adams County and have lived here more than 20 years? Let's say. Okay. Others of you, you're from outside. Now raise your hand if you've never lived in Gettysburg or Adams County. Okay, wow. Okay, all right. York County? Yeah, okay, all right, okay. Well, just a little bit about, before we begin formally, about I like to talk about why I picked this subject matter. So I say, if you need me to do a lecture, I can put something together, and then they do it. They ask me to do it, and then I have to say, well, I want to do something that is really, really important to me. And this is a topic that is really, really important to me because I have family ties that go back in this county and neighboring Carroll County, Maryland, back to the 1700s. And I've started to do some genealogical research, and it's deep, and it's both sides of the family going back and across those two counties. So above and below the Mason-Dixon line, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, right up until today. So this is who knows what this is? That's the Her Tavern. So this is. Oh, my mom's 90 years old, and if she knew I put a picture of her up on the screen just now, she'd be so embarrassed. But that's my mom and I. My mom's was raised in Taneytown, Carroll County, Maryland, and my dad went back and forth between the two counties. They met. They went on their first date to the movie theater in Westminster, which is now like at the Carroll Art Center. And anyway, her mother, my grandmother, who's the twin on the left, oh, so cute, the twin on the left, and that is her father, my great-grandfather, who was a judge here in Adams County, and my great-grandmother with the glasses there, who of course I never met, her father was Ephraim Her of the Her line. Okay, so I go back to some related to the Her family, and then my dad's side of the family. I really wanted to put a picture up here of my dad, but I didn't have one here at work. Hold on, I want to move this down. You were right. I need to move it down. These are my grandparents on my father's side. I never met them. Boy, I wish I had. And so Sanders, so I kept my maiden name. Sanders is a big Adams County name. And this is why I wanted to do this. I'm married to Scott Hartwig. His book will be out August 22nd. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. And so I helped him with the index. Never again. Oh, my gosh. Okay. So Scott is not from Adams County. Okay, he's lived here since the 80s, early 80s, but he's not from Adams County. And so, in addition to the family ties, the real reason I wanted to do this lecture is to settle an old score that he and I have been arguing about for a long time, which is, were the Gettysburg civilians helpful, or were they, stingy bastards? Basically, this is what the question I want to answer today. Because these are my people. And these really, literally my people. And I, of course, want to believe that they were generous in their support of the soldiers and the aftermath and everything like that. And in the course of my research for this lecture, that's what I was looking and hoping and thought that I would find. So those of you who came to my lecture last year, I preach about this confirmation bias stuff, right? And here I am doing it. I went into it saying, I'm going to look for this stuff that proves him wrong. Like any healthy marriage, that's what I was doing. And so what I found, though, was, well, I'm going to show you what I found, okay? And then I'm going to tell you at the end what I feel about it. So that's basically why I picked this, is to settle this score. So let's begin. The Sentinel, the Gettysburg newspaper, the Sentinel, on July 21st, 1863, said, "When the history of this war is written by future historians, the Christian charity of the people of Gettysburg will not be forgotten." So, will it or will it not? That's what we're gonna try to solve today. About a month ago, I was asked to cover a desk shift out here in the visitor center. It's not something I often get to do. And over the course of 3 hours, I met people from 9 different countries. And it once again reminded me that this hometown of mine and some of ours that we're so proud of, it means a lot to a lot of people around the world and in this country. It symbolizes sacrifice, honor, duty, courage, a country of the people, by the people, for the people. It symbolizes all of these things. But prior to the battle, it was not just a small, sleepy little town. It was a pretty cool town. It was the county seat of Adams County. It had about 2,400 citizens. There were 10 roads leading into the town. As we know, these are the same roads that would bring the armies to the area. It had a thriving carriage industry. A lot of the men in Company K were involved in the carriage industry in town. It had there were shoemakers, tanneries, merchants, banks, taverns, as well as the Lutheran Theological Seminary and Pennsylvania College, now Gettysburg College. It had a completed rail line in 1858 that connected Gettysburg to Hanover. The rail station here in town opened in 1859. It had 2 newspapers, the Sentinel, which was associated with the Whig Party, and the Compiler, associated with the Democratic Party. And the voting record, if we look at the voting records, now I was born at the hospital here in Gettysburg, but I am a Littonian, a proud Littlestown person. So you're going to notice that I'm not going to tell you the voting record of Littlestown. It was disappointing. This is my confirmation bias, okay? Okay, but the voting record in the election of 1860, Gettysburg went for Lincoln, 259 votes over 225 votes for other candidates. Adams County overall went for Lincoln, 2,724 votes over 2,718. Very close, right? In the election of 1864, Gettysburg again went for Lincoln, 259 over 178 votes for other candidates. And Adams County overall that year went 2,362 for Lincoln versus 2,886 for other candidates. Okay, so Gettysburg coming in a little bit differently than the whole county. So had the armies not descended upon the town, placing Gettysburg in the national spotlight, it most certainly would not be a national symbol today with a national park and visitors from across the country and the world. But our focus today is on whether or not the citizens of the town contributed to this transformation or if they were a deterrent to its national character after the immense tragedy that occurred here those 3 days in July 1863. And in particular, I approached this lecture looking at this question. Were its citizens instrumental or ineffectual in the transformation of Gettysburg from county seat to national symbol? So that's what we're going to kind of look through today. And you're going to see me sometimes like, yeah, take that. And other times, oh, no, that's not good. That's not good. So we'll see where it comes out in the end. First, there's kind of been 2 theories on the citizens of Gettysburg. So I want to review like kind of the origins overall of these theories. Okay, one theory is that the townspeople, we hear this with interns a lot in the summers, the townspeople were solely responsible for the cleanup and transformation of the landscape. They did it all. And then the other side of the argument is the townspeople were not only ineffectual, but they were downright stingy and unpatriotic, trying to make a buck on the war. Okay, so let's look at a little bit at where these origins begin. Theory A, I think it comes about because of the easy comparison of numbers. It's very easy to say, oh, there were only 2,400 people in the town of Gettysburg, and they had to take care of 51,000 casualties. That's a very easy kind of thing, numbers to grasp our head around. Tilly Pierce, in fact, who I'm sure you've all heard of, said, "My native townsmen during their terrible struggle acted as patriotic and bravely as it was possible to act." Yes, okay? But the reality is this. The reality is that 1/3 of the Union Army Medical Corps stayed behind once the field hospitals were consolidated at Camp Letterman, the large general hospital east of town. Along with the 1/3 of the Medical Corps, we also had the United States Sanitary Commission and the United States Christian Commission. So one of the buildings that still stands on Baltimore Pike or Baltimore Street was a warehouse for supplies and everything for the recovering soldiers. So they were here. They were not alone. They were not taking care of all of the wounded all by themselves. You also had the Provost Marshal's office organizing initial cleanup efforts, putting prisoners to work before they send them off to Fort Delaware and to Camp General Hospital in New York. And we have the Office of the Quartermaster. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what their duties were and what they were able to take care of. Okay, so the duties of the Provost Marshal, you can read, there's a book that I don't have here, but another really good source is Inside Lincoln's Army, which is Marcina Patrick's diary from who worked for the Provost Marshal. So Marcina Patrick, really, really interesting. We're going to talk about him a little bit more. But his diary entry of July the 6th, 1863, here are just some of the things that I can quote, some of the duties that they were taking care of. He was examining prisoners. He was establishing a depot for prisoners, which they moved to White Church because there was shelling near their headquarters. He was checking on the disorder of battle. In other words, they were working to keep the lines from breaking at various points. He was organizing a guard of stragglers to keep the 2,000 prisoners safe. He was sending off prisoners to Westminster. This was July 3rd. He, quote, started the cavalry on all the roads and over the battlefield to pick up stragglers and prisoners wounded from the rebels, returned to make final arrangements for leaving in the morning. He would leave July the 6th. So he's doing a lot of this initial recovery work. The Quartermaster Department, Captain W. Willard Smith was aide-de-camp on staff of General-in-Chief Henry W. Halleck and also an assistant quartermaster, and Captain Henry B. Blood. What a great name for somebody in the Civil War. Blood. Both men were ordered to Gettysburg on July the 6th to supervise the remaining burials, to rebury those improperly buried, and to secure government property on the field, including that which locals had carried off and were continuing to carry off, sometimes by the wagon load. Oh. Okay. Okay. Smith, to the Quartermaster General on July the 25th, wrote, "I have taken possession of 2 barns filled with hay belonging to a Copperhead, for which I agree to pay at the rate of $15 per ton. I told him if he could prove that he owned the tools, I would return them, but that I would not return the overcoat, and that he ought to be ashamed to rob a soldier who had come here to fight for him. I find too many such men. Many horses and mules are blistered, and in some instances the U.S. is cut out. Said he had no government property in his house. I insisted on going in and found a wagon load. I arrested the man and put him to work." Okay, we're not doing so good. My peeps here in the front, we're not doing so good. Okay? In fact, Sally Myers, who we're going to talk about, local young woman, local teacher, she talked about the local Copperhead sentiment. She said, the sentiment in Gettysburg was strongly Union, but at the same time we had in the community a good many Democrats, or Copperheads as we called them, who naturally affiliated with the South. They were not very open in upholding the Southern cause, but just seemed to think the South was right, and we often squabbled on that subject. I quote Greg Coco in Strange and Blighted Land, who had a good kind of assessment that about the quartermaster and how the local people should have viewed them, that their actions prevented disease and gave the land back to the people and the possibility to sow and plant and reap once more. So when I bellyache in a few minutes about all that the locals had to go through, I mean, they lost the crops. I mean, really, I really feel for them. But as Greg had pointed out in the book, they were trying to help them get back to a productive, the land producing. Okay, so that's so theory one. Okay, we see it wasn't these 2,400 people doing all of this stuff. So let's go to theory two. The origin of theory two, or theory B as I call it, primarily emerges from some key outspoken, some would say curmudgeonly individuals. That's Mersina Patrick that we've already heard from on the left, and on the right, Colonel Charles Wainwright, who looks the part of curmudgeon, by the way, whether or not he was. Patrick, on July the 5th, said, I was soon ordered by General Meade to go into the town and make arrangements with responsible parties for the burial of the dead and securing of the property on the field. Beckwith and I rode in. Had a great deal of difficulty in getting hold of some respectable parties to do anything with, the people being nearly all Copperheads. This was his thought. Later, he said, he came back to headquarters, quote, thoroughly disgusted with the whole Copperhead fraternity of Gettysburg and the country about as they came in swarms to sweep and plunder the battlegrounds. Charles Wainwright said they had, quote, damned themselves with a disgrace that can never be washed out. One man demanded $20 for bringing half a dozen wounded cavalrymen some 7 miles. I could go on. And I will, just for a brief minute, even though it hurts my heart. But what I want you to remember as I'm reading a few more, some of the best colorful quotes, is you're going to notice something in a lot of these quotes. At least I think you'll notice them. And I want you to remember that in the 1850s America, there was a lot of nativist sentiment, especially towards Irish and German immigrants. As a matter of fact, I found plenty of cartoons that demonstrated this sentiment. So we want you to listen for that, because there were a lot of German immigrants here in the town and county. And so, again, I know I'm coming into this because I want to find a certain result, but you can definitely hear it in quote after quote. So here are some other allegations directed at the people of the county. Surgeon William Watson of the 105th PA. I have yet to see the first thing brought in for the comfort of the wounded. Some farmers brought in some bread which they sold for 75 cents a loaf. The brave army that has protected this state surely deserves better treatment. Surgeon John Brinton. A good many of the farmers were Germans. I'm afraid of a low type and mean, sordid disposition. Their great object in this life seemed to be to hoard money, and their behavior toward our troops and our wounded soldiers was often beyond belief. Lieutenant Ziba, I think that's how you say it, Z-I-B-A, Graham of the 16th Michigan, wrote, I went into the house, found this man, a mean Dutchman, buried in the bosom of his family, and his family buried in the bowels of the cellar. I ordered him to give up the well crank. He first refused. I threatened to shoot him if he did not give me the crank. This brought it out of its hiding place back of the doorway. I went out and watered the boys. Private John Haley of the 17th Maine. Now, I'm going to remember the 17th Maine, because I'm going to quote another member of the 17th Maine later on in a completely different way. But Private Haley said, one female sauerkraut had the supply... yes, I know. He said that. One female, as a proud female sauerkraut, I'm like, what? One female sauerkraut had the sublime and crowning cheek to cut a loaf into 12 slices and ask 25 cents a loaf. And finally, maybe my favorite anti-Adams County quote comes from Georgiana Woolsey, a civilian volunteer nurse. If any time you would like to swear, call your enemy a Dutch farmer. Nothing can be worse. The Dutch farmers of Gettysburg have made themselves a name and a fame of the latest day by charging our poor men $3 and $4 each for bringing all that was left of their poor bodies after defending the contemptible Dutch firesides down to the railroad. So, again, we're going to come back to this nativist sentiment in a bit when we talk about Elizabeth Thorne. But if they were, in fact, a detriment to the armies and not helpful in the least, I want to just take a little bit, just a second, very briefly, to look at maybe why they may have been so. So remember these residents, okay, remember where they're living. They're just above the Mason-Dixon line, okay, very, very close to the Mason-Dixon line. On June 20th, there came down a message from Darius Couch that residents should see to their own protection. Okay, so now this is their clue. This is really happening. These soldiers are coming, and you are on your own. You're to see to your own protection. This necessitated a meeting at the courthouse, still stands on Baltimore Street, for, quote, placing the county in a state of military organization as would be deemed most advisable. So you have the geography of Adams County, just above the Mason-Dixon line. You have precautions of the civilians as they remember Stuart's raid from a year earlier. This is an illustration of that raid in Chambersburg. And you have the Confederate occupation, although not generally, but that's what I could find, of the Confederate occupation of the week before. And you read a lot of quotes from Sarah Broad, who I'm not going to get to on too much on this lecture, but the anxiety that is building as the Confederate flag is raised in the town square, and the unknown. That is what anxiety is. It is this fear of the unknown and what is going to happen. So, of course, like all of history, the answer to our question is shaded. It's multifaceted. It's complicated. It's complex. So, a quick answer, even a quick study. I wanted to do so much more, but even a quick study, we can begin to see some patterns arriving. So, I'd like to offer this afternoon a fast yet sweeping exploration of the contributions of generally Gettysburgians to the war effort, and in specifically highlight 10 people that I find very fascinating. I think you will as well. You'll discover or rediscover that there were Gettysburg natives who went off to war to fight. We don't hear much about that. Who withstood the horrors of battle and all of its anxieties. Some left town for safety and to return home to destroyed crops and ways of life and homes. They would work to rebuild their homes, their farms, and the entire community. They would care for the battle wounded, often in their homes, for weeks, sometimes months after the armies left. There were some who buried, reburied, and honored the dead of battle after the battle and years later. They commemorated the battle and recognized its importance to the history of the country. They hosted veterans and contributed to the preservation of land and the building of a national park, and they continue to host speakers, events, and tourists from around the world to this day. So I'm a proud, as you have already heard, Adams Countyan. I'm also a proud representative of the National Park Service, and I'm often in the middle of these types of arguments. So what I want to do is I want to look at, begin some of these stories of what the people of Gettysburg did in fact do. And those of you who don't know, there's a new museum that is opening, the Adams County Historical Society Museum Beyond the Battle. I got to preview it this past week, and a lot of these stories are and more are told there as well. So let's look at the first responders. Okay, first responders to the battle, the approaching battle. The 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Regiment mustered into service on June 19th. It was comprised of 743 men including a contingent from Gettysburg, 61 college students and seminarians, 21 townspeople, and a 14-year-old drummer boy. They had less than a week of training, and yet they confronted General Early's 5,000 battle veterans on June the 26th, 1863. Many were captured, they were marched back into town, and promptly paroled. So, not a big action, not tough, not very good, probably laughed at by Early's men, but they did it. Okay, they went out there, they volunteered, they tried to do it. Not to mention this guy who we all know and love, right? John Burns, and that's his house back behind the 26th monument there, incidentally. So there were, we sometimes look at the Gettysburg civilians and we just think of those who were here at the time of the battle. We don't think that there could have, that there were men who joined the armies to go off and fight from Gettysburg. And that's why the next fellow, Captain Henry Minig, is just an amazing person to me. He's in the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves. He goes off to fight in 1861, and then he finds himself and his unit at Little Round Top back in his hometown. So just want to briefly mention these, the boys who fought at home, as he called them. There were other regiments recruited in Gettysburg and Adams County. Company K was one of 6 units recruited in 1861. Other companies mustered in as late as September 1864. Some include Company G of the 138th Pennsylvania, Company E of the 2nd Pennsylvania, to name just a couple. May 15, 1861, the Pennsylvania legislature unanimously authorized the organization of 15 regiments to be enlisted for up to 3 years, subject to summons to defend the state, but liable for call into federal service by the president. The quota assigned to Adams County under this law was 1 infantry company of 77 men. There were 105 initial members in Company K alone. So, yay, that's on the yay side. Woo. Oh. Minig dropped out of Pennsylvania, now Gettysburg College, to be a teacher. He'd spent most of his life on the family farm near the Chambersburg Pike, but at the time of the war, he was married and living in town with his wife. Henry was wounded in the left arm at the Battle of South Mountain in 1862, but rejoined the unit and was in command of Company K beginning in March of 1863. Therefore, he was their leader at the Battle of Gettysburg. The battles of Company K began with Drainsville in December of 1861, included Mechanicsville and Gaines Mill in June of 62, South Mountain in September of that year, and then at the end of June 1863, they found themselves crossing over the Maryland line and heading for home. Here's what he said about that moment. Upon crossing the Maryland line, Colonel Talley announced to his men that they had entered Pennsylvania and would soon meet the enemy that had invaded its soil and threatened the safety of their homes and families. That he knew his gallant men would not rest until the bold invaders were driven from the borders of their beloved state. Though greatly fatigued in consequence of forced marches, both officers and men united in enthusiastic demonstrations of joy. Caps flew in the air, swords were brandished, and the men shouted and sang national songs. Minig was unhurt during the Battle of Gettysburg, and like several of the men in Company K, he found the time to slip away from the battle to visit his family in town. He was initially, they were hiding in the basement, unrecognized by his sister as he went down the stairs, but we do know that he was able to slip away. He was very respected by his men. Here's just one example of that. One of the men under him wrote at the end of the war, "I can never forget the captain's kindness of heart when in the service. When on the march, he used to come from the right of the company to the left where I was and kindly ask how I was pulling through, demanded my arms and equipment and also the knapsack, strapped them on his own tired body, and then ordering me to march outside of the ranks, took his place in the company and carried my burden." So this is the kind of guy that Gettysburg produced. He served with the unit until its term of service was over in June of 1864, and after the war, he returned to his teaching career, eventually became a minister and then authored the history of Company K. He is buried in the Soldiers National Cemetery. There were 105, as I said, members of Company K originally. 2 resigned in a few months, 7 deserted, 19 were discharged medically, 13 died while in service, 4 transferred to other units, 29 mustered into the 190th PA when their time with Company K was up. That was in June of 64. That left 31 men who mustered out on June 13th, 1864, and the local people threw them a little bit of a party, one of the guys said, and they got back to town, and they were supposed to go to this, they laid out all this food and had this nice welcome home, but they just wanted to get home, so very few of them actually went to the party. Initial members, there were 24 initial members from Gettysburg, 21 from York Springs, 9 from Fairfield, 5 from Emmitsburg, 2 from East Berlin. 53 were 21 years old or younger. 37 were between 22 and 30, and 10 over 30. And what that says to me is, you're a young man and you go off to fight, that's one thing. But you had a family and a job and everything, that's a whole other thing, and many of them did that. I have other things on them, but I'm going to return to Company K at the end of the lecture. But when they did return to the area, many of them in the following years after the war would move west, but many of them, like Minig, would stay and continue to contribute to GAR posts in Gettysburg, Fairfield, Abbottstown, Bendersville, York Springs, etc. So we'll come back to them. But the men of Company K, there's the book. But the men of Company K were not the only in the country who felt a sense of duty to join. Now, there were about 200 African American residents in the greater Gettysburg area. And of those eligible to join the United States Army with the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect January 1st, 1863, scores did so. As in fact, some historians, John Hoptack being one of them, estimate conservatively that of the eligible males, 40% joined. And one of those men was this man, Lloyd Watts. Lloyd Watts was born in Carroll County in February 1835. He moved to Adams County around 1848. After the battle, here, he and Randolph Johnson organized a black militia unit and drilled until they thought they were ready to fight. They offered themselves to the state, and we're not sure, but we think for some reason they were turned down. His older brother, John, enlisted in a United States Colored Troop regiments in August of 1863, and Lloyd joined in February 1865. He trained at Camp William Penn with Company B of the 24th and was very quickly promoted to sergeant. He was stationed at Camp Casey, which was near Alexandria, Virginia, to guard Confederate POWs, and eventually at Camp Lookout, Maryland. He mustered out at the end of the war and returned to Gettysburg to teach at the colored school and to serve as deacon at the AME Zion Church just down the road. In 1866-67, he was one of the men locally who helped founded the Lincoln Cemetery. I'm going to come back to this movement as well, the burial ground initially for black soldiers. Lloyd Watts would die in 1918, and he would be buried right there in Lincoln Cemetery. The Gettysburg newspaper one of the Gettysburg newspapers recorded he was, quote, one of the oldest and most respected colored citizens of Gettysburg. And then this obit that you see on the screen said, Lloyd Watts, enjoying the confidence and highest esteem of not only his own race, but all who knew him, passed away Sunday evening at his home on South Washington Street at the age of 83 years. So, no matter how we look at Gettysburg being above the Mason-Dixon line, it was, by and large, still a very, very segregated community at that time. Black school, black cemetery, and the mention of race in his obituary in the town paper. He was survived by his daughter, son-in-law, and 10 grandchildren. So, the final group of soldiers to join from Adams County were men who found themselves joining the Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, and fighting on ground that they once called home. So there are 5 that we know of. Most people know of Wesley Culp, so I thought I would talk about Henry Wentz. Wesley Culp joined the 2nd Virginia, and then there were the Huffman brothers, Robert, Frank, and Wesley. And then there was this 35-year-old artilleryman who was asked to aim a Napoleon directly at his family home, where his father was at that time hiding in the basement. So this is Henry, let me just go back. So you can see all that's left of the Wentz property, or the home there, is the foundation right along the Emmitsburg Road. And if you look off to the left from there, you would see the James Warfield farm. This is an artist rendering. If you go to the right of this rendering, that's the Emmitsburg Road. So this is roughly an artist rendering that's going to be on a wayside, if it's not out there already, from about the perspective of the Longstreet Tower. Okay, so that's where Henry Wentz was posted. He left Gettysburg at 25, the age of 25. This was in 1852, to move to Martinsburg, then Virginia, now West Virginia. He had steady work there as a plasterer, and he eventually enlisted in a militia unit called the Martinsburg Blues. By the time of John Brown's raid in mid-October 1859, the newly named now Wise Artillery, of which Henry is a part, are on the scene to fire upon and eventually capture Brown and others. At the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, Henry is in Taylor's Virginia Battery, and they roll 4 bronze Napoleons into a battle line along Warfield Ridge near Millerstown Road, 20 yards south on land owned by James Warfield. Anybody here know about James Warfield? What do we know about him?
Blacksmith. African-American blacksmith.
Yes. Yep, an African-American blacksmith lives on the out there on the property, finds his farm now directly on the Confederate line of battle. So essentially, here are 2 former neighbors who kind of represent the entire conflict, right? And they're going to play this out. Henry's mother, Mary, and sister Susan were sent away to safety before the battle began. His father, John, was hiding in the cellar. On the Wentz property was the 2nd New Hampshire Company B. And Private Wyman Holden of that company said, quote, "The rear of the farm looked like a sieve from the numerous volleys of canister which had passed through it." So now there's a lot of folklore surrounding this, right? Did Henry visit his father? We hear that. How did the house escape destruction? Someone wrote in 1871, quote, "because a son of the owner was serving in the rebel ranks, and at his request they spared it." I kind of probably think that's not what happened. Why didn't they ask any of these local Gettysburg guys who were in these Confederate units about the town and where properties were and they didn't ask them that, so they're certainly not going to not fire on the property if they request it. So we don't know too much. We don't have a photograph of Henry Wentz. We don't know too much about him. He never returned to Gettysburg. There was another property that his father would leave him in his will. He would come back to Gettysburg to help his father close out the estate. But he himself would die in December 1875 at 48 years old, and he's buried in West Virginia. So his Gettysburg story ended really, for all intents and purposes, on that day in July 1863. So here we have residents of Gettysburg fighting for both sides, brother against brother, truly. So besides those who volunteered for military service, the war was, for a long time, seemed very, very far away. I try to put this in perspective for children when they come here on a battlefield. So they didn't have TV, they didn't have, they had newspapers, so they were aware that the war was going on. It's taking place in the South. They certainly don't think that it's ever going to come this far north. Now they're going to have to prepare for it, literally to come to their doorstep. So that in addition to men fighting, I wanted us to think about Warfield for a minute and the damage to his property. So we have to remember that this is a farming community by and large, and it's not farming like the garden I have in my backyard, and I'm so proud of my radishes, but I don't need them, right? So this is farming at a time, subsistence farming, where if they have an 88, well, think of Lydia Leicester, who's leaves town, and she comes back and she finds that her house and barn were used by the not only the commanding general of the Union Army, but the winning general, right, in the battle. So kids often think she should be really, really proud. She was not proud. We have one oral history account of her being downright ornery about it, right? So her peach trees are destroyed. She has to redig her well. There's dead horses everywhere. So this is a widow who needs to feed her children. So she is not thinking about the broad meaning of the war at all. She's thinking about how is she going to feed them. Here I go again, looking for confirmation bias and really feeling for these people. So I just wanted to review just very quickly, some of the things that these people had to deal with now that the battle's here. They have the general anxiety about the occupation of Confederate troops. There were demands of General Early for foodstuffs, shoes, and hats of the town fathers. Sarah Broadhead said, "No one can imagine what extreme fright we were in when our men began to retreat." They have their food supplies are cut off with the destruction of the railroad bridge leading into Gettysburg. Newspaper, mail, telegraph also cut off, so they have no news of what's going on. There's added anxiety for the black residents of the town. The McCrearys, you've heard of probably Albertus McCreary, who left an account after the battle, young man. They had a black washerwoman. They called her Aunt Liz. She hid in the belfry of Christ Lutheran Church for 2 days. So you can imagine it's enough anxiety if you're white, right? But now imagine you could be returned or turned into a state of slavery. There was looting. Sarah Broadhead also said that another family near her had left during the day, and robbers went in and kind of cleaned out the house. The townspeople, quote, secreted, sheltered, fed, and aided in every way some of the Union men when after the first day of July, when the Confederates are winning, forced to retreat. And I'm going to talk about Schimmelfitting in a minute. There was the extremely foul air left after the battle with the dead, rotting corpses, and then the horses. Horses were piled and often burned. And so Cornelia Hancock, the nurse from New Jersey who came to town and spent months here, called it the sickening, overpowerful, awful stench. So you've probably all heard of what they had to, just to walk around, put perfume on a cloth and cover their mouth and nose. Otherwise, they felt like they were suffocating. If you go by a dead raccoon or something on the road, that's bad enough. Now you've got to multiply that. That's what they're dealing with. They had a fear of pestilence, as they call it, from the post-battle conditions, exposure, and sickness. So, we don't put that into the casualty. The people who they didn't know about germs at the time of the Civil War, but they believed in open air, flowing air. They thought stagnant air is what caused disease and sickness. They didn't know about germs, so they're trying to guard against additional sickness. They had the flies and other vermin around. They got requests in the newspaper to help clean up property beyond their own, to provide horses, wagons, manpower, to bury the dead and to cleanse the streets. One thing that, they did not have the term of PTSD for military or non-military, but think of the emotional stress over what they've witnessed. One resident found Baltimore Street lined with unburied men and other pictures of destruction which will never fade from my mind. I have to think that's going to stick with them for the rest of their lives. Harvest timing. Okay, this battle took place in July, so there was loss of food for the year, including their livestock, and any means to feed the livestock that remained from their crops. There's an estimate of some 60,000 Army horses and mules that needed to eat. So the armies had some food, but they're largely going to feed them off of the land. And whose land are they? Now, this is, of course, people, the civilians in the South had been dealing with this for 2 years. The people in Adams County are dealing with it now. The work, the weight, the anxiety, and often disappointment for damage compensation. So I'm going to talk to you about just some examples of this harrowing process that went on for decades of tallying how much you've lost and proving, having affidavits and proving, any lawyers in here? Proving in the legal system like this was damage done and I've lost on this property and trying to get some compensation for that. That's going to go on not just for months but for years and often decades. And then as we can all relate to this, having gone through a pandemic, the suspension of home life, church life, community, any sense of normalcy. The fact that many of them had to very quickly dive into skilled nursing and even more. The fear of unexploded ordnance. Heck, we just had that the other week, right? So that was a very, very real thing. And caring for, and then eventually caring for the caregiver. So there's going to be family members coming to town looking for their loved ones that they haven't heard of since the battle. And then decades later, there's going to be reunions, veterans reunions, and now visitors, as I mentioned, from all over the world. So these are just a few examples. So I want to look at a couple more people in particular. Sorry, I'm supposed to have that slide up. So hospitals and barns. Well, there's Elizabeth Thorne's property. We're going to talk about her, the dead, and then the bottom slide there is Camp Letterman General Hospital, which was in existence where Giant and Ruby Tuesdays and all that is now until November 21st, 1863.
For the Historian has a wide variety of titles, new and used, of military books from publishers like Osprey, Gettysburg Publishing, Stackpole, Savas Beatty, UNC Press, and more. I make it a point to go there once a week because I have new bookshelves to fill and I never know what treasures I'll find, and neither will you. They even have toy soldiers, model kits, games, children's books, and more. So stop by and check them out on your next visit to Gettysburg, or better yet, order right now online at forthehistorian.com and mention that you heard about them on Addressing Gettysburg in the Note to Seller box, and they will refund you your shipping. And if you call 717-685-5207 or stop by the store on your next visit and mention us, you'll get 20% off retail price. That's forthehistorian.com or 717-685-5207.
If you're a lover of history, then go to trhistorical.com. There you'll find apparel, decor, and gear, and our listeners will receive 10% off plus free shipping within the U.S. if you use promo code GBERG1863 at checkout. So take advantage of this deal at trhistorical.com. TR Historical, for the love of history.
You've heard us promote various ways that you can help us keep the show going, but one way we haven't pushed too much is our sutlery at addressinggettysburg.com/shop. That's a shame because we have designs over there by talented artists like Ty DeWitt of 1863 Designs and Mike Stretch of the Heritage Depot. So now we're promoting it. Buying shirts, hoodies, mugs, and other items from our sutlery not only helps us keep the lights on, but it also helps guys like Ty and Mike, and it helps spread the word about the show every time you wear an item or you sip from your mug. So head over to addressinggettysburg.com/shop and grab some merch. It's the perfect Christmas gift for the Gettys nerd in your family. That's addressinggettysburg.com/shop.
Hey Gettysburg business owners, winter is just around the bend, and you know what that means, no tourists. But just because people aren't coming to you doesn't mean you can't bring your business to them. If you ship, you're still in the game. And if you're a seasonal business, the time to advertise for your next season is in the off season when people are making their plans. So what's an affordable yet highly effective way of reaching those people? Well, it's not radio. It's not TV, and it's certainly not print. Step out of the Jurassic era of advertising and run an ad on Addressing Gettysburg. We just reached 1 million downloads, and we're growing by the tens of thousands every month. Beyond that, our audience is happy to support those who support their favorite podcast. So email sales@addressinggettysburg for more information about advertising on our show. We look forward to helping your business grow. That's sales@addressinggettysburg.com.
So let's talk about just a few of the women and how they dealt with the battle and the aftermath. Have any of you heard of Catherine Garlock? Okay, a few of you. Most times we hear about her daughter. She's actually in our Anna Garlock. She's actually featured in our museum here. But I have found a great appreciation for this woman. This is a post-Civil War photograph of Catherine Garlock. She was hard as nails, and I like to think that this was the Gettysburg woman. This was the hard as nails woman. So here is a photograph, courtesy of the Gettysburg Daily, of the Garlock property. Her husband was a woodworker. He went up to Cemetery Hill to check on things where the armies were and all that. He didn't come back the whole time of the battle. And so Catherine Garlock ends up, well, first of all, prior to the battle, from June 15th to the 30th, she's feeding numerous soldiers. On July the 1st, she is taking care of Schimmelpfennig. You've all heard the story of General Schimmelpfennig hiding in the back there from the Confederates, and she is going out there very carefully to pretending like she's doing other things to make sure that he is being fed and it is okay. Here's the thing that I had never heard about until recently. She's got 11 neighbors plus the 4 of them in the house. Okay, there's sharpshooters all over the town. And they have to go to the basement. The basement has inches of water in it. So what would you do? She goes out, I'm fascinated by this, with her young son to her husband's wood shop, brings in stumps and boards and makes a makeshift floor on the basement of the house. Tells one family, you're there, you're there, you're there, and we are over here. And this is where we are going to stay, and we are going to wait at the battle. And she tries to feed them. I'm got to move quickly because I'm running out of time. But she feeds them, waters them, and when multiple occasions sharpshooters come to the door, they want to use her attic as a hideout, and she just says, no way, you are not coming in this house. And she holds them at bay. She does not allow them to come in her house because she knows that then it will be a target. She and her son Will take a peek from the top window, and that top window is fired upon just after. So that only hardens her resolve to keep them out of there. Henry and Catherine later would provide room for Captain Charles Roberts. Captain Charles Roberts was an adjutant of the 17th Maine. Remember before I mentioned a quote from somebody in the 17th Maine negatively towards the town? Well, now this guy in the 17th Maine, he had his leg amputated after being wounded in the wheat field. And he stays there with the Garlocks through August 1st. And he continues to visit the family whenever attending GAR reunions in Gettysburg. Catherine talks about church services returning to the area on July 29th and a return to normalcy. You've probably all heard of Sally Myers, the 21-year-old school teacher. She lived on West High Street. She was speaking to the general anxiety of the Gettysburg civilian population when she said, "We had a vague idea that the rebels were a dreadful set of men, and we didn't know what horrid things they might do, so we mostly kept in our houses out of the way." On June 26, she reported, "We were not afraid, but it is exasperating that we are now under control of armed traitors." So she was very pro-union sentiment, but this is a point that I want to make. She was a woman of her time. So she was not, abolitionists were extreme at that time, so she was a pro-union sentiment, but she was a woman of her time, and she talked about, spoke of, quote, pitying the darkies as they skedaddled out of town. So she had empathy for them, but again, this is a very segregated town at that time. On June 29th, she says, "We may expect a battle both near and soon. God help us, for surely our cause is one of justice and humanity." I just can't believe I'm almost out of time. But I'm going to move a little quickly. But Sally Myers said, as you can see on the screen there, that I had never been able to stand the sight of blood, but I was destined to become acquainted to it. So she tended to wounded soldiers at home and at the Catholic Church. She eventually would head out to Camp Letterman. She provided a lot of food, like a lot of the townswomen did when they were called upon to do so. And she famously, the first soldier that she treated died, and she famously then got to know his brother and married his brother, the Reverend Henry Ferguson Stewart, brother of Alexander. Henry Ferguson Stewart died a year after they were married. Their son Henry becomes a doctor, and she often helped him at the practice. She went back to teaching, but she was also very active in the Sons of Union Veterans, the National Association of Army Nurses, and she was the treasurer of the GAR here from 1903 to 1922. So continued to contribute, understood the importance of her town in the Civil War to the country. But Myers, like every human being, is complex. So we tend to put people into one box or another, and we do that with all of history as well. So what I'm getting to is, what I've learned from doing this lecture is there were some great people, heroic people in this town, but there were also some people maybe who weren't so great. And that's what history is. It's complex, it's messy. Very quickly, Elizabeth Thorne, she was the caretaker with her husband Peter of the Evergreen Cemetery on Cemetery Hill. Peter went off to fight. They're both German immigrants. He went off to fight for his new country. She was living in the right-hand side of the gatehouse there with her young children. Her aging parents, were living in the left-hand side at the time of the battle. They had been married in 1855. By 1863, she has 3 boys and is pregnant with a daughter. General Howard positioned batteries inside the cemetery, makes the gatehouse his headquarters. It becomes a field hospital. There are surgeries in the house. She stays on the safe side of the horse, as she calls it, and shows someone in the Army the roads and everything and where they can get. They were looking for a man to do that, but she stepped up to do that. When she returned to the house, or as she was returning to the house, the president said, "There's more work for you than you are able to do." So she comes back to the house. She's like, "What does that mean?" There's no glass in the windows. Her furniture's destroyed. 17 people were buried in the garden near the pump house. 15 dead horses in one field, 19 in another. She said, "For days I could hardly eat because of the disagreeable odor." She did 105 initial burials of soldiers inside Evergreen. And the cost to Elizabeth Thorne, as you can see from the statue that now stands in her memory inside the Evergreen Gatehouse, she was 5 months pregnant at the time, and that daughter would not live to adulthood. So that was the cost to Elizabeth Thorne of this battle and the exposure to all of it. The thing that gets me about Elizabeth Thorne is that she wrote that she wore the same dress for 6 weeks. She put on a heavier dress than usual. She's burying the dead, and she wore that same dress for 6 weeks. So, hold on one second. So while Elizabeth Thorne could handle over 100 of the initial burials, the ground zero location for the aftermath of battle was the home of local attorney David Wills. I won't go into David Wills too much. I think many of you have probably been to the David Wills house, now open on the square. It was in his home and also at the dedication of the Soldiers National Cemetery that he coordinated, where Gettysburg truly begins its transition from the site of a major Civil War battle to a symbol of democracy, liberty, and justice for all. As you can see here, Marcina Patrick said, "I took a cup of coffee at the house of Mr. Wills and called together the leading citizens at his office." It was also in the David Wills house where he sent out the invitation to Abraham Lincoln, where Abraham Lincoln would spend the night. and complete the Gettysburg Address. And it was also from that office where he would create the broadsides that you see there, looking for men who would step up and finish the burial work surrounding the town. So the dead soldiers buried surrounding the town. So that's the only photograph we have of Lincoln delivering the Gettysburg Address. But before they became those honored dead in the National Cemetery, they were the awful dead, as Margaret Crichton writes in her book. And one of the people, key, I'm going to go through these very quickly, in that reburial process was this man, Basil Biggs. Basil Biggs was an African-American man who was 44 years old when he joined the burial detail. He had just moved his family up from Maryland 5 years earlier, but was already established in the Gettysburg community at that time. He was a farmer. He was reportedly an Underground Railroad agent. He was known as a veterinarian without training, but many called on him for his veterinary services. He fled toward York when the Confederates were first reported to be coming north, and returned to find his rented farm had been used as a Confederate field hospital. He likely needed the burial detail job about which Wills had sent out the broadsides because of his wrecked farm. Cows, pigs, wheat and oat field, carpets, beds, chairs, jams, and jellies are some of the things he mentioned as a loss. So this process of burial, this is the burial detail in Hanover, Pennsylvania, and Samuel Weaver standing there, the bearded man with a book in his hands, writing down, taking notes. They were not, many of you probably already know, they were not issued identification tags or dog tags at the time of the Civil War. So this process of going out in the fields surrounding the town, often they could tell where a trench grave was by the ground would give a little. It would be spongy. There would be an air pocket there. It was near the site of a battle, so they could dig up these trench graves that maybe had been covered with a foot or two of dirt. Sometimes the graves had been opened numerous times by family members coming in to look for their loved ones. They would remove and record the things found in their pockets and try to determine the name or the initials, the state, and the unit where they were from, and then put War Department coffins were in the wagon. There's a good description of this both in A Strange and Blighted Land and in Margaret Crichton's book, and then put the bodies into those coffins, and then by wagon, with their horse-drawn wagons that they're providing, bring them in and rebury them in the National Cemetery. One resident wrote, "Words would fail to describe the grateful relief that this work has brought to many a sorrowing household." And Basil Biggs was not only key in the burial detail, but I think really represents, again, the transition of the local people from, okay, let's do this initial work, but then we got to get back to our life, to start to see that Gettysburg is going to be this, it's not going to go away. It's going to be this bigger deal. So you may have heard the story of Basil Biggs owned the copse of trees, right? The clump of trees. And many years later, he is chopping them down. And Batchelder, the first historian of the Battle of Gettysburg, is talking to all the veterans and writing and just coming to the reunions, and he's trying to piece all it together, sees Basil Biggs. This scene is fantastic, right? He sees Basil Biggs chopping these down, and he tells him, wait, you can't do that. You know, we know you maybe you need the money for the wood, but this land is worth a lot because it means a lot to our country. And so Basil Biggs stops chopping the trees down. Basil Biggs is also buried in the Lincoln Cemetery on Baltimore Street. And so other Gettysburg residents would more quickly estimate the long-term symbolism of the Gettysburg battle to the ideals of Americans and work toward closure and reconciliation. And I just wanted to mention Rufus Weaver. Rufus Weaver was the son of Samuel Weaver. And Rufus Weaver, with the death of his father was killed, who we just saw back in the other photo, was killed in a railroad accident in 1871. He had all these lists of the dead and records of the graves, and he passed those down to his son, Rufus Weaver. He was born in Gettysburg in 1841, graduated from Pennsylvania College in 1862. Then he went to Philadelphia to study anatomy, and this is going to become very important to the work that he does here. By 1871, he was splitting his time, when his father dies, he was splitting his time between lecturing in Philadelphia and then beginning to work for the Southern Ladies Memorial Associations in Gettysburg. What he did was he used maps and records of his father and others to go out and find the Confederate still buried at the request of the ladies' associations in the South. He looked for the Confederate dead and would help tirelessly work to return them without any compensation, really, to Confederate cemeteries in the South. From April to September 1872, and again from April to October of 1873, he spent 7 weeks in Washington, D.C., obtaining data and copying thousands of names of the Confederate dead. He worked for years to get compensation for this work, right up until 1892. His knowledge of anatomy was absolutely essential to this process. He said, "I not only superintended the general work on the field, but personally did the most important part myself, viz. Picking up the bones, for, in the absence of boxes, it required one with anatomical knowledge to gather all the bones, which workmen could not do, and regarding each bone important and sacred as an integral part of the skeleton, I've moved them so that none might be left or lost." So he in other words, he's not just putting everything into a box. He's trying to piece together the remains of these men. His crucial note-taking, like his father, about each set of remains was important to this work, as in this example. Quote, "Under walnut tree at bend of the road on Mr. Crawford's farm, 3.5 miles from Gettysburg on Marsh Creek." So he's documenting where he's finding all these men and trying to piece it all together for their families. Samuel Weaver lived to age 95. He passed away peacefully in 1936. His obituary mentioned some of the things that he had done medically in Philadelphia, but they didn't mention anything about this work. But a bronze plaque was erected on 2014 on Lefevre Street. I just passed it this morning. And another one in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, quote, "acknowledging a debt of honor owed by all Southerners and recognizing his generosity and humanity." And my 10th person, returning to Company K, I just wanted to talk about Calvin Hamilton. Calvin Hamilton was another man in Company K who would eventually serve as the first superintendent of the soldiers, or as one of the first superintendents of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. At the time of the Civil War, Calvin lived halfway between Gettysburg. This is a later photograph of him, of course, but he lived halfway between Gettysburg and Bidlerville. So do I. And was entering the freshman class at Pennsylvania College when he decided to join Company K. He was 20 years old at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. He attended the Presbyterian Church. So do I. He was severely wounded in the leg on July 2nd, 1863, and the surgeons wanted to amputate. He insisted otherwise, and he went home here in Gettysburg to regain his strength. They did not amputate his leg. He was transferred, though, to the Veteran Reserve Corps for the remainder of his service, which, likely means like lighter duties, like guarding government buildings or forts, or helping out at a general hospital or things like that. After the war, he became a teacher and eventually the superintendent of schools. By 1889, he was serving as the superintendent of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. And when he died, he was buried in the cemetery that he had helped care for, on the battlefield where he had received his wound, and in the town that he had called home for most of his life. Hamilton, I think, is a representative of the contributions of Gettysburg and Adams County residents for decades in organizing and hosting reunions and contributing to the infrastructure of the War Department and then Park, and then what would become Gettysburg National Military Park. This is what his obituary said, March 14th, 1914. "Under his care, the final resting place of the nation's heroic dead has always been kept in the most immaculate condition, and visitors from all over the country and from many portions of the world received the most courteous treatment when visiting the beautiful place. So, before we wrap things up here, I did want to mention that a few things about 1866 and beyond, because I really wanted, you put together this stuff and you just want to tell you people so much stuff and you have to cut it off at some point. So I'm only going to mention 1866 and beyond. But I want you to know that even as these things are going on, right, the people are still trying to get damage claims. Here's some examples of what I mean. Lydia Leicester in 1887-88 filed for $800, and it's hard to make sense of these damage claims because there's so many legal things going on. There's so many things. So some people, like maybe my husband, I'm not sure, maybe Greg Coco, I'm not sure, would have said that, they're inflating these claims. And other people, maybe me, maybe you, Sin, might say that they have to inflate them because they know they're not going to get, very much. And right? Okay, so Lydia Leicester in 1887 and 88, she's still filing for $815.87 in damages. And she received $24.50. We have the photographic evidence of the damage to her. So, she received $24.50. In 1882, she had filed for $554.24, and we think received $52.50. Okay, the Slider family, the base of Big Round Top, was still filing after John Slider, head of household, passed away. They claimed in 1876. Okay, so the Slider farm is where Texas and Alabamians go across to okay. So and then they retreat back across the farm. They bury some of the Confederates there on the farm, etc. They claimed $782.25 in 1876. Another time they claimed $566.50, but that claim was disallowed. That's the word, disallowed, as Confederate troops were the ones who did the majority of the damage. So they weren't going to receive anything because it wasn't the Union Army. I mean, war is a costly and expensive thing, as we all know. So they did not. So they eventually moved to Ohio, and the descendants of the Slider family are still living in Ohio, and some still farming in Ohio. And I know that because I took them around the Slider farm about 10 years ago. It was amazing. Abram Bryan, who's the African-American farmer right up there on Cemetery Ridge, claimed $1,028. He ultimately received $15. So Abraham Bryan had to eventually move back into town and work as a laborer. He would ultimately lose his farm. James Warfield claimed $500 and was authorized to receive $471, but there are doubts as to whether he ever really received a thing. So these records are very difficult to go. So I just wanted to let you know that all that is still going on, and there's a lot of other things going on too. So during the Sons of Goodwill, this is a sign in the Lincoln Cemetery, and it talks about the Sons of Goodwill formation in 1866. This is what the Sons of Goodwill were. The African-American men formed it to do three things: take care of the sick, to honor the dead with proper burial, and number three, and here's the interesting one, to celebrate Emancipation Day on January 1st. So here is a group of men who wanted to celebrate Emancipation Day in Gettysburg, the broader meaning of the battle and the war. Another example are the reunions. So I didn't get a chance to get into this so much, but there's a book called War Memory and the 1913 Gettysburg Reunion by Thomas Flagle. And at the very beginning of the book, he says, within 2 weeks of the idea of having this reunion, a second meeting at the Adams County Courthouse drew 150 people. The list of attendees read like a local geography primer. Donald McPherson of McPherson's Ridge, William Ziegler of Ziegler's Grove, Theodore McAllister of McAllister's Mill, etc., gathered to see whether such an undertaking was even feasible. Okay, yes, I love that. So they're all getting together, right? They're not complaining about the tourists and all these people coming in. Reverend Dr. J.A. Singmaster up at the seminary said it should be, this, meaning the reunion, should be celebrated out of gratitude to the noble, heroic men who gave their lives here for a new baptism of liberty. So they're contributing to the growth and a broader understanding of Gettysburg in the Civil War. But even these efforts are met with healthy and sometimes biting skepticism. From Strange and Blighted Land, the National Tribune of July 5th, 1888 said, quote, okay, these hurt my heart, but I'm going to read them. Ask a sarcastic visitor what the people do for a living, and they will answer, nothing. They live on the people who come here. They sell pretended relics and poor photographs. They take boarders during the celebration days, and thus they get a revenue which seems to satisfy them. And later, when you come to reflect that the battlefield covers an area of ground of 25 square miles, it will be seen that carriages are a very necessary institution in getting about. But they put up the tariff to such an extent that it would make a Niagara Falls hackman turn green with envy. And so here we return to our question. Were its citizens instrumental or ineffectual in the transformation of Gettysburg from county seat to national symbol? I'm going to tell you what I think. Let's hear what you think. How many of you think, yes, they were instrumental in transforming? How many of you... Scott, are you watching? How many of you think they were ineffectual in the night? To say the least, they were ineffectual towards the transformation. It's okay, you can be honest, because I'm going to tell you what I think. Okay. Well, 3 final quotes to wrap us up today. Robert McCreary said, "I do not believe any community has exhibited more generous devotion towards those thrown upon their hands. In every community there are heartless and sordid persons to be found, and doubtless there are such here, but they are exceptions." So I feel that. I feel Robert McCreary. I appreciate that sentiment. The Sentinel I returned to from the beginning of the lecture. When the history of this war is written by future historians, the Christian charity of the people of Gettysburg will not be forgotten. I'm trying to do my little bit today to make sure that they are not forgotten. And then perhaps Gettysburg's most famous resident, Dwight D. Eisenhower, spoke here on Memorial Day one year, and he said, "On this day of commemoration, Lincoln still asks of each of us, as clearly as he did of those who heard his words a century ago, to give that increased devotion to the cause for which soldiers in all our wars have given the last full measure of devotion." And I include him as a resident, and I include that quote because this is still going on. What Gettysburg means is always contested. There are always various things that happen every year that prove how relevant this town and the battle and the cleanup and the Gettysburg Address, how relevant they are to all of our lives. As, again, a proud Adams County native Gettysburg resident, as well as a proud representative of the National Park Service, I hope to have done my part today to help us all remember the instrumental contributions of Gettysburg citizens to maintain and progress the national ideals now symbolized here in our small town, but to remember them in a real way, not as idealized heroes or as stereotyped lowlifes looking for a handout, but rather as a complex, full people who were not perfect, but they were thrust into the largest and bloodiest battle ever seen on the continent. When we think of them in this way, indeed when we study history in this way, and we hear history talked about in its teaching all the time, we hear what librarians are dealing with what books can be taught and what books cannot be taught, what teachers should be teaching, what teachers should not be teaching. It's in the news all the time. But when we think of them in this way, Indeed, when we study history in this way, we better understand and respect the contributions made toward our continually changing definition of what it means to live in a community and to live in a country of, for, and by the people. I thank you very much for your attention today. It is 2:48. Darn it, I went over. Thank you very much. Oh man. Thank you. I have time to take any questions. I have to be at my youth club in about 45 minutes as a contributing citizen of the town, but I'm happy to take questions.
Samuel Weaver's records, are they here? Where are they?
Samuel Weaver's records, I don't think they're here, but I don't know, and I will find out.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. We have so many things here that I don't know of. Yes, sir.
I don't know what Wainwright looks like, but you misidentified.
Oh, are you sure?
Yeah, absolutely.
I ran this by Scott. Who do you think that is?
Patrick is the curmudgeon on the right.
Oh, are you sure about that?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Have any questions? Yeah, Dale.
Just wondering, Calvin Hamilton?
Yes.
Was he in relation to Hans Hamilton?
I don't know. Who was Hans Hamilton?
Well, he was earlier. He was like during the Revolution.
Oh, okay. I think
they were both members of our church.
Oh, is that right? Oh, that's because you're the historian at our church. It could be. I know that he at one point I was reading something, and I know that like my ancestors and his, I know they probably knew each other, and that makes me very excited. But anyway, we can check that out. Okay. Well, anyway, I will ask Scott. Anyway, I want to thank all of you this is the last winter lecture of this year. We thank all of you for your participation and for coming in and supporting it. It means a great deal to us, and I hope it means a lot to you, and we'll see you next year. Okay?
Need a Corps badge or other insignia for your uniform? Then check out the Badge Maker. Here's what some of his satisfied customers had to say. Miranda said, I ordered an identification disc from Joe and it's fantastic. He hand-stamped it exactly as I wanted. Greg said, my unit has purchased from him in the past quality badges and good service. And Jerry S. says, the Badge Maker is the go-to place for accurate replica Civil War badges. So go to CivilWarCorpsBadges.com and attach a message with your order saying you heard about him on Addressing Gettysburg.
Our hearts so stout have got us fame, for soon 'tis known from whence we came. Wherever we go, they dread the name of Garryowen in glory. Instead of spa or drink down ale and hail